Now that the model is prepared for sculpting and the scene is set up properly, we can begin adding some edge damage to all of our stone pieces. Before I go into the sculpting mode, I would always advise you to turn on the perspective so that your view doesn't get distorted and you don't get a flat angle from wherever you look. Just gives a more natural representation of your object. With that being said, we can begin and sculpt our model. Thanks to the polygroups we created earlier, now we can go and pick each piece individually. So if I hit Ctrl Shift and click the piece that I want to sculpt on, I isolate it in my view and can only focus on this one. And for the first part, adding the edge damage, I'm going to press B, go into my trim brushes with T, and then I click D or go to this one here, Trim Dynamic. I sculpt in freehand mode and I apply a square alpha. And then I can start sculpting away. And what I want to do here is create some edge damage to the border of the pieces to give it a stone look. And I'm very just going in there and just create some edge damage, some more, some less. And don't forget, if you make too many mistakes, you can of course Ctrl Z the object or go into your morph brush and get back the area. Also, I don't want to damage the object too much. We still need to keep the original shape because we're going to bake it down onto the low poly. And in order for our normal maps to work, we can't go in and just chip off an edge like this. This wouldn't work in the baking. So I'm using a smaller brush and I'm just keep on adding damage to the edges. And this can be quite dirty because later we're taking another brush and we'll clean this up a bit. This is just to give it some variation. When I press S and drag the slider, I can increase and decrease my brush size instead of going all the way to the top here and change it over here, so I have a bit of a faster workflow. This is quite nice, but I think this edge is a bit banked up too much, so I'm going and take my morph brush and do it again. And make it a bit more subtle and not as deep. Again here. And as you can see, the morph brush comes in quite handy if you take a second look at your model and you don't want to Ctrl Z and go back until the point. Then when I'm happy with what I created, I put my mouse cursor into the dark, hit Ctrl Shift again and click, so that the rest of my model is going to show up. Again, I'm going to get rid of the gradient because it came back when I opened the scene again. And I'm moving on to the next model. With this one, since it's smaller, I'm also going to decrease my brush size a little bit. And I'm going to be a little more careful here with the edge damage, because I still want to keep the original shape and just want to add some damage to it. I'm going to do the same for the inside. And I'm being extra careful here in the corners. Next I'm going to sculpt on the top piece. And again I'm using just the same principle. If you're wondering why the edges at the top and the bottom came back, is because Dynamesh automatically closes the holes of your object. So don't worry about sculpting on these because they are not part of our UV map and you can ignore them. Now that I'm happy with that part, I'm going to work on the upper middle part of the pillar, and for this I'm going to add a bit more detail into my sculpt of something that I didn't want to model in, but which I can bake in later. So for this I'm going to turn off the perspective view to have a flat view, and then I'm holding my control key so that I'm in mask mode, and I'm going to use the drag rectangle to create a selection mask. Something like this. Then I go into masking, inverse it. I can also hit Ctrl I to do this. Then I'm going into top view, turn on my grid so I know where the middle is going to be. I press E on the keyboard so that I'm in scale mode. Then I drag from the middle and I'm going to scale it inwards. And thanks to the masking, only the masked part is going to be scaled down. This is looking quite good. Now I'm doing this again to find the middle of my object. And I'm going to move this down by pressing W so that I have a bit of a bevel here. When I'm done, I can just go hit B, T, D to get back to my trim brush, turn off the wireframe, hold Control, drag into the open, and my mask is gone. And this is how I inserted this piece that I didn't want to model, but I'm going to bake in later for the normals. Now I'm taking my brush, and by holding Shift, I'm going to smooth this area. So I go over here, and I'm going to give this a bit of a smoother edge. It's very subtle, because I'm going to sculpt over it in a second, and also the downside. Like this. And now I'm going back to my trim brush and start the sculpting process again on the edges, like we did before. And also, of course, on the other side. Then, with a smaller brush, I'm going to do the same to the inside that I've created. Being very careful here, because there's not a lot of room to sculpt. But just so that the edge isn't completely straight and you won't see the smoothing too much. When I'm done, I'm going to end with something like this. And I can move on to the other pieces. For these pieces, I'm not going to do anything special. I'm just going to sculpt in the edge damage like we did with the top 3 pieces. I'm going to skip this part and come back to you, and we'll move on after we are done with this. Okay, I'm almost done with sculpting in the edge damage. Just doing a few more fixes to the lower part of the pillar. And going to wrap this up by sculpting on this piece. Again, I'm not worrying about the backside of this one because it's inside of the pillar and we didn't create any UVs. for the inside, like this. And this already is the first pass on our sculpting, and as you can see, the pillar already looks a bit more convincing and does look like it's made out of stone.